1300 BC, two great empires were battling for regional dominance. The powerful Hittites and the mighty Egyptians. This is the story of Ramses II, a brash young pharaoh whose bold military tactics put not only his life, but his empire in danger. The fate of Egypt and the entire Middle East hung in the balance when the two armies clashed at the Battle of Kadesh. A battle of deception, treachery, and raging chariots. At Kadesh, 17,000 Hittites came face to face with 20,000 Egyptians. Both forces were fighting to expand their spheres of influence and ultimately to control the Middle East.
The Battle of Kadesh represents one of the most important battles in antiquity. It represents a clash of major empires, the Hittite Empire and the Egyptian Empire, in a crucial zone of military operations around Kadesh, which is in modern Syria.
Egypt, located in northeastern Africa. The Hittites' homeland, called Hatti, was about 1,000 miles away in what is now Turkey. But this battle between the superpowers was played out between the two homelands, in an area called Amurru in modern-day Syria.
The Amurru is the ancient world's crossroads. If you want to trade, you need to travel through the Amurru. If you want to attack someone, you need to travel through the Amurru. And if you want to prevent attack, you need to control the Amurru.
The Hittites were led by their young king. Believed to be in his early 30s, Muwatalli was known for his intelligence in battle. The Egyptians were led by Pharaoh Ramses II.
Ramses II is the son of Seti I, who was one of the great warrior pharaohs of Egyptian history. Ramses comes to the throne at about age 22, 23, and sees himself in that long tradition of warrior pharaohs. Indeed, like the great warrior pharaohs who preceded him since the establishment of the Egyptian Empire 200 years earlier, Ramses sees himself as actually the personification of the Egyptian military tradition to accomplish two things. One, to make sure that Egypt never again is threatened, that Egypt is safe, and secondly, to expand the borders of the empire against Egypt's enemies.
Hostility between the Egyptians and the Hittites had been brewing for centuries, stretching back to both empires' infancies. Egypt emerged around 3200 BC as a collection of feudal settlements along the fertile Nile River delta. Over the course of several thousand years, it grew and spread, but remained at peace with its neighbors, which had its advantages and its disadvantages.
The advantage of having a country that's prosperous and at peace for so long is it becomes incredibly well developed in terms of the arts, engineering, architecture, painting, poetry, and religion. It's amazing from that perspective. The disadvantage is the world is spinning on around you. New technological developments are occurring, and you're not part of that deal. And as long as you don't have to interact with the outer world, it'll work. What happened in 17th century or 1650 BC is the Egyptians got the rudest surprise of their life.
The surprise came in the form of an attack from the north. The invading Hyksos were from the city-states of Canaan and Syria. These northern warriors swept into Egypt on a bloody path of destruction.
Egypt was almost hermetically sealed from the greater influences of the outside world, so the invasion came as an incredible shock. It shook Egyptian society to the core and changed it forever.
The Hyksos occupied Egypt for nearly 80 years. Eventually, the Egyptians rebelled and fought a 30-year war of liberation. They finally succeeded in driving out the Hyksos, but northern influences remained strong.
One of the positive consequences of the occupation of Egypt by the invaders from the north was the transfer of their superior military equipment into the Egyptian army.
The Egyptians adopted the use of new hand-to-hand weapons. and a new way of maneuvering around the battlefield. The two-man war chariot. But the Egyptians didn't just adopt the chariot, they improved it.
The Egyptians essentially made three major changes to the chariot, which revolutionized its application in warfare. The first of these was to move the axle and wheel from the center of the chariot, as is the case of the northern invaders, back to the rear of the chariot.
The axle was about 3.5 feet in length, set back as far as possible for greater balance, speed, and maneuverability. The chariot's platform was about 3 feet wide, 1.5 feet deep, and 2.5 feet high. The frame was made of wood, steam-bent ash or elm, covered with animal hide or reeds. The floor was made of flexible layers of leather or specially woven cloth to help the archer balance and absorb shock. The Egyptians also replaced the Hyksos 4-spoke wheel with a 6-spoke wheel. This simple alteration made for a much stronger wheel, a wheel better able to withstand speeds of up to 12 miles per hour along bone-jarring, uneven terrain.
And probably one of the most amazing technological innovations was the creation of what's called a U-joint, where the pole of the chariot coming off the horses joins the cab of the chariot.
Because this joint was able to move and wasn't locked in place, it could absorb a lot of shock. This not only ensured the integrity of the chariot, it also made for a more stable ride.
You put this all together, and you end up essentially with the Egyptians having changed the machine to such a degree, it would be the equivalent of essentially having a superior modern main battle tank on the field.
The chariot represented a huge step in warfare because it brought mobility to war. And of course, it also became a sign of status. If you were a nobleman, you wanted to be a chariot warrior.
The individual chariot squad consisted of 3 men. The driver navigated the horse and vehicle across the battlefield. The archer had to be sufficiently skilled to fire arrows from a moving platform at speeds of up to 12 miles per hour. The runner ran alongside the chariot for both offensive and defensive purposes.
As a defender, he protected his chariot from opposing runners, but he would also attack enemy chariots, dragging warriors out of their machines and slaughtering them. In modern warfare, you never send in tanks without infantry support. That's exactly what this is like.
The runner fought with a bronze sickle sword. About 3 feet long, the sword weighed approximately 2 pounds. When wielded with sufficient force, it could slice off a limb or a head. The runner might also have a 6-foot spear, its shaft made of wood, the head razor-sharp bronze. Having revamped their fighting force, the Egyptians developed a new strategy of attacking the enemy first. A strategy they were to put into action some 30 years after their liberation from the Hyksos.
When Egypt had secured her own domestic position, had rebuilt her army, she turned to the north for revenge. And at that point, you have the formation of the Egyptian Empire and the beginning of its expansion to the north into Canaan and what is now Lebanon and Syria.
The Egyptians' quick and nimble chariots gave them a great advantage as they spread north and conquered most of their enemies. But as they began to move into what is modern-day Syria, they came into contact with the Hittites, also expanding their territory. And they, too, had chariots.
Egypt and Hatti are separated by nearly 1,000 miles, but both are threatened by one another, and both see the land between Egypt and Hatti as an essential buffer zone.
Initially, when you do that, the buffer zone is, of course, just that, a buffer zone that's expendable. It's not the homeland. But over time, what happens? The defense of the buffer zone becomes almost identified with the defense of the homeland. And so you end up fighting wars and wars in the buffer zone.
For centuries, the Egyptians and the Hittites have been spilling each other's blood in small skirmishes as they clashed over incursions into the buffer zone. Sometimes no more than an infantry fight, but at other times, the chariots engaged.
When people think about chariot warfare in the ancient world, what they imagine is lines of chariots either smashing into enemy infantry or lines of chariots smashing into another line of enemy chariots, okay? That's not how it worked. A little thinking will show you that horses will not charge against a phalanx of infantry spears, and there wouldn't be much point in trying to slam into an enemy chariot. More commonly, the way chariots were used when they were used against chariots was essentially in a kind of swirling combat. The lines would attack towards one another, but they would never really get in contact. The object would be for the archer on each chariot to pick off the archer or driver or horse of the other chariot. As they pass by, or in military terms, what's called en passant, as they pass by one another. Then they would wheel around, whirl around, and come back at one another. Sometimes not at the same target, but picking the closer target.
While the two-man Egyptian chariot was light and mobile, the Hittite chariot was a larger, heavier, and slower vehicle. The axle was positioned in the center of the carrying platform. Although this reduced speed and stability, it had its advantage. The chariot could carry a crew of 3. The charioteer, archer, and runner all rode together into battle. It's believed that this innovation went back many years to when the Hittites defeated another enemy, the Mitanni, who lived in the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In addition to ridding themselves of an enemy, the Hittites gained the wisdom of the famed Mitanni horse trainer, Kikuli. Kikuli's methods influenced the future of chariot warfare.
What Kikuli did was to write a training manual on how to train horses to be stronger and able to pull heavier loads. This was huge because it enabled the creation of a completely new chariot and a new way to fight with chariots.
With two-man chariots, the runner had to obviously run alongside. This inhibited how fast and how far they could travel, because obviously the runner, who was the chariot's main defense, would be completely exhausted.
But Kikuli-trained horses were able to pull a larger chariot with 3 men inside. Thus, both the Egyptians and the Hittites had improved and perfected their own style of fighting vehicle. And after hundreds of years of mistrust, a confrontation between these two great chariot cultures was about to take place on the plains of Kadesh. Two armies, Egyptian and Hittite, were on a collision course leading to one of the greatest battles of antiquity, the Battle of Kadesh. Kadesh was located midway between the two empires in modern-day Syria. For many centuries, the Egyptians and the Hittites have been engaged in small skirmishes, each believing the territory to be of strategic and tactical importance.
The skirmishes at the edges of both empires, the Hittite and Egyptian empire, just wax and wane on and off for about 30 years, and which no real conclusion is ever reached. They're just border skirmishes and not quite serious. But what happens while these skirmishes are going on is a very bizarre event, and that occurs inside Egypt itself, that will, in a very strange way, set in motion a series of chain reactions that leads ultimately to the clash of both empires at the Battle of Kadesh.
This chain reaction began with the death of the famous pharaoh Tutankhamun in 1323 BC.
Well, Tut dies, and according to Egyptian law, his widow can choose a new husband. In Egyptian tradition, it's the female's bloodline that is royal, not the man's. So she can marry whomever she wants, even the commoner.
What she does in an act that by today's standards would be insane, it was actually regarded as insane at the time, is she writes a letter to the king of the Hittites saying, "Send me one of your sons. I will marry him, and he will be Pharaoh."
My husband has died and I have no son. They say about you that you have many sons. You might give me one of your sons to become my husband. I would not wish to take one of my subjects as a husband.
Turns out that Tut's widow believes Tut was assassinated by his own subjects. For many years, Egypt was in a tremendous amount of internal turmoil. between traditional polytheists, Egyptians who believed that the national religion should continue worshiping several gods, and monotheists, those who believed in only one god. It was a terribly bloody time in Egypt.
Civil war erupted throughout Egypt, resulting in thousands of deaths. Some believe Tutankhamun was among the victims.
Now, at this point in Egyptian history, the polytheists had greater power in Egypt, and they were also enemies of Tut's widow. So what's their solution? Essentially bring down the empire, make a Hittite prince pharaoh. Absolutely incredible. The entire Middle East would have completely changed.
If the Hittites could absorb Egypt and her territories, they would control every trade route and every military position from Egypt to Mesopotamia. Keenly aware of the political advantages, the Hittite king agreed to the proposed marriage and sent one of his younger sons to Egypt. The event that followed was the spark that ignited war. Egyptian enemies of Tutankhamun's widow discovered the marriage plan and ambushed Zananza, the Hittite prince. They killed him before he set foot on Egyptian soil.
Eventually, Tut's wife dies. Some say she was murdered. But the bigger point is how the Hittites reacted to the assassination. As you can imagine, the Hittite king is furious.
The Hittite king was the great warrior Shupilululiuma, who was predictably enraged. His desire to avenge his son's death led to a resumption of war against Egypt. But revenge wasn't his only motivation.
Shupilululiuma isn't stupid. He's not going to allow the death of his son to drive the empire's foreign policy. It is, however, a good excuse to start fighting again over the valuable Amurru region.
Shupilululiuma led his forces against Egypt for nearly a decade. But around 1322 BC, the Hittite king was killed, not by the blade of an enemy sword, but by an invisible and far less predictable foe.
One incident in which Egyptian garrison was overrun by Hittite troops who took some prisoners and apparently transported the prisoners back to the Hittite homeland in modern-day Turkey. It seems, or at least there's some evidence to suggest, that some of the prisoners had been infected with some kind of a plague. And the plague not only infected some of the soldiers of the Hittite army, but spread throughout Anatolia and much of the Middle East, with the consequence is that the death rate was so high. Indeed, the king himself died of this disease.
After Shupilululiuma's death, the skirmishes between the Egyptians and the Hittites lessened significantly. It was during this period of relative stability, around 1300 BC, that Ramses II became pharaoh. Only in his mid-20s, Ramses was a warrior king with a reputation for being brash and cocky. He understood that to protect Egypt, he had to occupy the buffer zone to the north.
Ramses comes from a military tradition, and he sees himself not only as the pharaoh of the period of time in which he rules, but as a continuation of that tradition of great warrior pharaohs that has come into existence since the Egyptian empire was formed 200 years earlier. So when you look at trying to get inside of his head, what you're looking at as a person who sees himself not only as a great warrior, but a man whose primary function, primary purpose, primary reason for existence is to protect Egypt.
5 years into his reign, Ramses launched an attack against the Hittites. He led 24,000 troops north, up the coast road towards Gaza. His force was divided into 4 divisions, all named after Egyptian gods: the Amun, the Ra, the Ptah, and the Seti. Each division was comprised of 6,000 soldiers, 5,000 infantry, and 500 two-man chariot teams. When the Hittites learned of the Egyptian expedition, they immediately countered with a force of about 17,000 sent south from Hatti. Their general was the grandson of Shuppiluliuma, King Muwatalli. Like Ramses, Muwatalli was a warrior king.
We don't know much about Muwatalli, but the texts suggest he was a good thinker. He fought with his head and had a good strategic mind. He went into these battles with a game plan, and he stuck to it. In many ways, he was a perfect foil to Ramses.
Both forces were heading toward the city of Kadesh. While control of the city was not the end goal of either army, whichever did so would find it easier to conquer the entire Amurru region. Kadesh was built on a small rise near the mouth of the Orontes River Valley. The city was surrounded by casement walls, two 50-foot-high parallel walls, each about 400 yards long.
The important thing about Kadesh is that its walls are faced with limestone. And although its walls are casement walls, its walls are faced with limestone. Why this is important, and very important for 200 years of the Egyptian attempts to push the Syrians and the Hittites north, the problem was they couldn't take the cities. And the reason why they couldn't take the cities is because the battering ram, the effective battering ram against stone, was unknown. It did not make its way into the Middle East until the 8th century.
Ramses wanted to get to Kadesh first to avoid having to attack its stone walls. But when he finally did reach the city, he was in for the surprise of his life. The Egyptian pharaoh, Ramses II, commanded an army of 24,000. They were on their way to the Amurru, a strategic buffer zone between Egypt and the Hittite homeland of Hatti. Near the town of Byblos, Ramses divided his force. He personally led 3 divisions, the Amun, the Ra, and the Ptah up the Litani River. These 18,000 soldiers were to approach the strategic city of Kadesh from the south. He sent 6,000 of his troops, the Seti division, north along the coast. They were to cross the Lebanon mountains and approach Kadesh from the northwest.
What Ramses intends is essentially a pincer movement against the city. The larger force up the valley comes in this way, and what happens coming from the west is a smaller force at the city of Kadesh. So that's the strategic plan.
This is a massive undertaking. Ramses' army takes up 15 miles of road on the march at 4 abreast. Some 4,000 mules and donkeys are needed as transport. Each soldier requires 3 pounds of grain made into bread each day, 8 to 9 pints of water.
On a march like this, lasting over a month, about 17% of the manpower would be lost to sprains, broken bones, lung infections, things like that. It's quite a feat to move an army of over 20,000 men some 500 miles and arrive in fighting condition.
After a grueling 40-day march, Ramses and his 3 divisions made camp 10 miles south of the city of Kadesh, near the forest of Rabawi.
But to say that Ramses' 3 divisions all camped together isn't quite accurate. Yes, they all stopped at the same time, but there are a lot of troops. So the guys at the back were 15 miles away from Ramses in the front.
Ramses is now pretty deep into the Amurru, and the Hittites could be anywhere. Whether he fails to send reconnaissance scouts up ahead or they don't discover anything, Ramses has no information as to the Hittite whereabouts.
Near Ramses' camp, Egyptian patrols captured 2 local Bedouin and questioned them on the location of the Hittite army.
We know from temple inscriptions that Ramses had a pet lion that he took with him on campaigns. It's been suggested that the lion was used to, how should I put this, encourage cooperation.
According to the Bedouin, Muwatalli and the Hittites were still 100 miles away, to the north of Kadesh at Aleppo.
Now he sees an opportunity. Kadesh is defenseless. I can grab it, I can use it as a logistics base, rebuild my army, get everybody rested, and then we're just a short step up the road to confront the Hittite army.
Ramses is so excited that he jumps on his chariot with his bodyguard and starts for the city of Kadesh. But here's the problem. Ramses, in his youthful enthusiasm, takes off and his army is spread out over 15 miles behind him.
The Amun division quickly gathers its stuff. It's not in battle-ready conditions. It's stuff slung over its shoulder at any time, and it starts boogieing up the road, trying to catch these guys.
Ramses began to make camp on the plain, whilst the unprepared Amun division slowly caught up with him. The Ra was strung out a few miles behind. The Ptah was still near the forest of Robawi. And the Seti division was somewhere on the coast of the Mediterranean.
Ramses thinks it's a walk in the park. His bodyguard starts building the camp. Elements of the Amun division just begin to arrive in the camp. Everything's kind of disorganized. The Ray division is route stepping it across an open plain, and Muwatalli springs the trap.
From orchards south of the city, there emerged 2,000 Hittite chariots.
They burst out of the orchards, take the Ray division right in the flank. Bang!
Just imagine turning to see thousands of Hittite chariots. Even for a trained army like the Egyptians, it would have been utterly terrifying. Ramses' Ra division is absolutely laid to waste by these chariots.
They're not battle ready, they're not formed for battle, they just get hit and they scatter all over the plains.
The Hittite charioteers traversed the chaotic battlefield, the archers firing with precision accuracy.
Chariot archers and their drivers worked as pairs. That is to say, they trained together, and their horses trained together, on and off, hour after hour after hour.
Both Hittite and Egyptian archers used a composite bow made of wood, horn, and ox tendon laminated together.
A composite bow is an awesome weapon. It has a very high penetrating power and deadly accurate in the hands of a good archer.
Some archers joined the runners on the ground to engage in the infantry battle. The Hittite king, Muwatalli, was, some historians believe, already inside Kadesh and had orchestrated this surprise attack. The Bedouin story had been a lie. Ramses and his army had been hoodwinked. Muwatalli's plan was brilliant. (1279 BC), the Battle of Kadesh had begun. A vicious Hittite chariot ambush against an unprepared Egyptian force resulted in the first spillage of blood. And it was Ramses' responsibility.
Pharaoh, in his haste, took off practically by himself. He's only got maybe a couple of hundred soldiers with him.
Bedouin spies had given Ramses false information that the Hittites were 100 miles to the north at Aleppo, when in reality, they were already in the city of Kadesh.
It never dawns on anybody that maybe somebody, like the Hittite intelligence officers, put the Sashu Bedouins up to the story, namely that this is a classic piece of intelligence deception to lure the Egyptian army into a trap.
As Ramses sped off to claim the city, he left his forces unprepared and strung out behind him for 15 miles. At the same time, 2,000 Hittite chariots stealthily made their way south along the east side of the Orontes River, hid in the orchards, then smashed into the Ra division.
One of the things that happens on a battlefield is as tactics or situation changes, what happens is, if you're not careful, you let operational success drive strategic goals. You start changing the goals. That's a basic mistake. And in this case, that's exactly what happened with Ramses. Given the opportunity suddenly to grab Kadesh, he could hardly resist it. And he took it and fell right into the Hittite trap.
Some historians believe that the key to Muwatalli's successful ambush was the three-man chariot. Thanks to special endurance-trained horses, the Hittite chariot carried the charioteer, the archer, and the runner. This allowed the chariot force to travel the 2.5 miles from the city to the orchard quickly without exhausting the runners, the chariot's main defense.
Chariots aren't supposed to be able to move like this. The ancient world has never seen chariotry like the Hittites bring to bear at Kadesh. I firmly believe that the 3-man chariot innovation completely changed warfare. And I really believe that at Kadesh, the Hittite surprise attack was directly related to this type of chariot warfare.
The result was the slaughter of thousands of Egyptian soldiers. Ramses watched the carnage from his camp. The pharaoh was about 2 miles north of the ambush site. His only defense was the disorganized Amun division on the outskirts of his camp. About 15 miles to the south was the 3rd Egyptian division, the Ptah.
And somewhere to the west is the Set division, who has come up the coast. So Ramses is in real trouble because his army is so spread out.
And Ramses was the Hittites' next target.
The Hittite chariots turn north and take dead aim on Ramses' half-built, disorganized camp where the Amun division is just stumbling into camp, trying to keep up. And bang, as they smash right into the camp, dismount from their chariots, and this terrible infantry battle erupts.
The Hittites mauled the Egyptians. To make matters worse for Ramses, many of his elite chariot teams fled the battlefield, abandoning their king in his most desperate hour. Then, suddenly, the Hittite advance towards Ramses' camp slowed. Instead of continuing to charge toward the Egyptian pharaoh, many of the Hittites began looting the camp.
But that's not even the real problem. The real problem is the Hittite infantry is nowhere to be seen on the battlefield, and that will prove costly.
10,000 Hittite infantry and 1,000 reserve chariots were waiting on the east side of Kadesh.
To have 10,000 infantry doing nothing doesn't make much sense. Muwatalli has Ramses against the ropes, and he should commit his infantry to knock him out.
But Muwatalli did not deploy his infantry. Despite the slowing of the Hittite attack, Ramses' situation was still dire. He had no choice but to take matters into his own hands.
Now, Ramses is no weekend warrior or a spoiled prince. He's led his army into this trap, and he's prepared to lead his remaining troops out. So he and some of the elite infantry guard, and pretty much all that's left from the Amun division, march into the fray.
You know, people say he was a braggart or whatever, but he was one hell of a soldier. What he does is he rallies what chariots he has, rallies his Amun around them, and literally takes a section of the attack to the northeast, which probably was the weakest area, and attacks it.
Ramses' attack gathered momentum and began to drive the Hittites back. But his forces were too scattered to make a significant impact. Muwatalli still held the advantage, and he could have ended the battle quickly by deploying his 10,000 reserve infantrymen.
Now is the time. You got him by the nose, kick him in the ass. Now's the time for Muwatalli to commit his infantry. Commit it across the northeast, commit it across the ford, northeast of the city, and it would have been all over. Chariots coming up from the south, infantry from the north. They got the commander. It's over. He doesn't do it. He does nothing. And so the Hittite attack bogs down. It's essentially trapped in the camp fighting an infantry battle. It's given away its advantages in shock and mobility. It's stuck in an infantry battle. He has a hammer fist of infantry, and he doesn't commit it.
Muwatalli's failure to deploy his infantry remains a great mystery to scholars. Ramses, however, was still in trouble. Despite being mired in an infantry battle, the Hittites fought furiously. But Ramses' luck held.
At precisely the right time, marching down through the pass, across the Lebanese mountains, onto the plain of Kadesh, comes the 2nd Egyptian force, the Seth Division, at the precise time to Ramses' rescue.
Ramses' Seti Division, which had been marching up the coast from Egypt, finally reached Kadesh.
The Seth Division brings with it 5,000 infantry and 500 chariots. Ramses now has the force he needs to push the Hittites across the Orontes River.
A great chariot and infantry battle raged on the plains outside Kadesh. Because the battlefield was so congested, the mobile Egyptian chariots were able to maneuver more easily than the heavy Hittite ones. Ramses had successfully turned the tide.
Finally, Muwatalli launches reinforcements, but not infantry. He sends 1,000 chariots.
Muwatalli's chariot reinforcements moved south from the city, across the Orontes River, then headed north towards the battlefield. Suddenly, they were attacked from the rear. The final Egyptian division, the Ptah, was ready to join the fight.
Muwatalli, he forgot about the Ptah division. Now, I mean, it's got eyes. There's a hell of a battle raging over there. We better not cross the plain in route step. They're in battle formation. And they're marching up on the plain just as the Hittites crossed the Orontes and turned their back to them. Bang! They hit them in the back and shatter the Hittite reserve force.
The Hittites were caught in a vice. Ramses, the remnants of the Amun division and the Seti division were battling in front, while the Ptah division attacked from the rear.
Muwatalli, he committed a grave error, and that is never throw good forces after bad. If you're going to use forces, you do it to exploit a victory. You never do it to stave off a defeat. And he did it for the latter reason.
The Hittite chariots cannot escape. They have Egyptian forces on both sides of them, and they can't maneuver because they're right in the middle of Ramses' half-built camp.
2,000 Hittite chariots were lost. Muwatalli had squandered an overwhelming advantage. But despite Ramses' ability to turn the battle around, the Egyptians had also suffered badly.
Most of the Amun division is probably dead. A good part of the Ray division is killed, certainly scattered. So he lost half his force. And a goodly number, at least two divisions of organic chariots, just 1,000 machines, maybe more. So it's been a bad day at Black Rock all around. The sun sets on the battlefield, dead and dying horses and individuals screaming.
The Hittites retreated to their base behind Kadesh. The Egyptians didn't attempt to pursue them.
In the morning, Muwatalli sends a message to Ramses, like, this has gained no one anything. Let's just mutually disengage. We'll fight again another day. Ramses accepts. He has no choice. He has no hope of moving north of Kadesh.
But that didn't prevent Ramses from proclaiming himself the victor. Depictions of a great victory at the Battle of Kadesh were engraved on monuments throughout Egypt.
Ramses records the Battle of Kadesh as a great personal victory, and of course, we have multiple sources in the archaeological record, so we know that he exaggerates. But if you consider that he ultimately saved himself and his army from what could have been complete annihilation, his version of the truth makes some sense.
Before Ramses returned to Egypt, he took care of one final piece of business.
Ramses assembled the chariot commanders of the units that had broken ran under attack, forced them to kneel in the dust with their hands tied behind their back, and personally beheaded some of the sons of the most powerful nobility of Egypt.
It's a bloody finale to one of the bloodiest battles of ancient times. And Ramses makes sure that his army knows the price of failure.
Ramses learned his lessons from the mistakes he made at Kadesh, but his error was repeated by some of history's great generals.
George Armstrong Custer fell into a similar trap as Ramses did at Kadesh. He was chasing a group of Indians when he failed to detect the main force. Having driven off the smaller group of Indian raiders, he got ready to attack what he thought was a defenseless and small village. To his surprise, an enemy of greater strength took him onto the flank. Unlike Ramses, Custer was killed, but the mistake and the tactics were the same.
The two ancient superpowers continued to fight over the strategic buffer zone for several years after the Battle of Kadesh. Then in 1262 BC, the Egyptians and the Hittites were forced into an alliance against the growing threat from what is now Iraq, the Assyrians.
And that alliance lasted for almost a century. So in the same sense, perhaps like the Battle of Berlin in World War II marked the point where two superpowers met and essentially tolerated one another because they couldn't shove the other fellow off. Same thing is true of the Battle of Kadesh.
The Battle of Kadesh was not the overwhelming victory that Ramses boasted of to his people. It was the story of a brash young monarch who rushed into war, found himself outwitted, then fought his way back to save himself and his empire.